providing practical, cutting-edge wisdom, embracing all parts of the human experience into a map of transformation, accelerating soul alignment for individual and collective ascension. We are your hosts, Jonathan Mosenter
and Soraya Rachel
on the Relationship Alchemists.
Hi, and welcome back to Episode 4, Human Connection, the Path of Intimacy. We're now in the second person perspective, which is the you perspective, and it works with interpersonal awareness. In this case, more in the one-on-ones with lovers, friends, family, and how we can create true, authentic, genuine connection.
Yeah, we're going to be learning how to develop different skills. How can be applied with lovers, friends, family, co-workers, any kind of relationship. And we're going to be talking into different parts. We're going to start off with verbal communication.
Yeah, so when we talk about communication, the first thing I always like to cover is actually understanding how it works, because you'd be surprised how much clarity this can add when we acknowledge all the places that breakdown can occur. So when Jonathan speaks to me, he has an idea, and he encodes that idea into sound. And then he transmits that sound, and then I receive that sound, and then I decode it back into an idea or a meaning. And so this process is where a lot of things happen.
Yeah, there's a model by Chris Ardress, and he describes there's 4 things going on in every dialogue, every conversation. So 2 of the things the person speaking is aware of, and 2 of the things the person receiving are aware of. And so I'll just break what those 4 parts are. 1 is I am aware of my intention. So right now my intention is to describe this model to you. I am also aware of how other people are coming across to me. So right now Soraya is right next to me. I can see she's looking intensely, or that's my interpretation of it. So those are the 2 things I am aware of. Now the things that I'm not aware of, like in a conversation with Soraya, is I don't know always what her intentions are, depending on, I have to guess based on her behavior and what she's saying. Unless she's saying specifically, this is my intention. And I am also not aware of how I come across to her. And a lot of miscommunications happen because of people are only aware of parts of what's going on, and the other person has the other half. And so the solution is to be aware of those 4 parts and start getting into conversations like, hey, this is my intention, and hey, this is how you're coming across to me. And then you can start opening up those parts of communication and get to actually what's happening at a deeper level.
Yeah, I've even used this tool at times with couples to work with their looping patterns and actually make diagrams of the archetypal pattern that keeps playing out, and identifying where in this process the breakdown is occurring or the assumptions are being made. And so this can be a very powerful tool for reconciliation. Next, we're going to talk about active listening, which is also super important for strong communication. And it seems straightforward, but it's crazy how often people miss this. It's literally listening with the intent to understand, not the intent to respond, not waiting to make your point. Active listening is something deeper. We're hearing not how we would mean those words, but attempting to understand the other person's coding of ideas in language. And so it's a little bit of reading between the lines and a lot of asking questions that get to more precise understanding of what the other person is saying. And that leads very seamlessly into reflective listening, which is to share what you understood about what the other person communicated back to them before offering your next thought in the conversation about whatever they said. Before you offer an opinion back, say in the closest personal re-speaking of that what was encoded so that you can identify that the communication was fully received before continuing in the communication. And a lot of times when we talk about nonviolent communication, this is one of the steps that really diffuses tension in dialogue. Is there's a misunderstanding wound or a not feeling received that's generated and creates tension and resistance because reflective listening isn't happening. And so there is no confirmation that the way that the speaker is encoding language is actually creating the meaning that they intended.
Another important part is to speak concisely. I'm sure we all can notice times when we've been with a person where they're rambling on and it's really hard to follow them. And out of respect, it's good to take a pause and think about how can I explain what I'm saying in the least amount of words to get to the quintessence, the essence of the point you're trying to make. And that's a skill we develop over time. And also it's important to speak accurately. We want people to be we want people to understand what we're saying, and we want to be speaking the truth. So we want to speak in facts that we are verifiable. Or if we're saying our opinion, we want to clarify that this is our opinion and not our fact, and this is our story of something versus this is a truth.
This is the colloquialism: mean what you say and say what you mean.
Exactly. Also, there's a whole very powerful field called conscious language. It has a lot of different aspects to it, so I'm just going to speak to it specifically, but it's about getting really conscious to what we're speaking, the understanding the tone that we're speaking from and the words and what effect they have on us. This includes conscious language that we're speaking in our inner dialogue, but also with other people. And we want to speak powerfully. We want to speak in the present tense. We want to own things. We want to speak what we want to see in existence rather than what we don't, because that's a lot more powerful. And
an example of this that comes out a lot in culture is through the word should. Should is fundamentally a word that limits the scope of possibility based on people's cultural programming. It creates the sense of something has to happen because of some preset conditions. And so when we step into deeper levels of conscious language, we often will cut back on the use of that word and certain other words because we become more aware of their impact. For example, when we have two sentences with a conjunction word, the word but cancels out the seriousness or the meaning of the first half of that sentence. So if I'm like, yeah, I totally get what you're saying, but you're kind of diffusing the feeling of what came before, because in the but you're replacing it with what comes after. So those are just a couple really quick examples. There's so much to unpack with conscious language, and it's a really beautiful, deep legacy.
Another really important area of interpersonal skills is giving and receiving feedback, and how to do that artfully and skillfully. First off, it's often best to say, to ask permission. Are you open to feedback now? That way it sets the table and the tone a lot better than just giving someone feedback blindly, and they could possibly interpret that as like an attack or criticism rather than a heartfelt, like, hey, I want to help you, or I have a perception that I'd like to discuss with. Sometimes even softening your feedback with, like, hey, this is my perception rather than this is the truth, helps people receive things better. And in terms of receiving feedback too, it's really important to, if when possible, just to drop your defenses and be like, hey, this person might have something truthful to say. They might not. I'm just going to take it from a heart-centered place and not allow it to triggers. And if triggers comes up, sometimes it's good to allow those to come up, but maybe see them as triggers and not immediately go back and be defensive. A lot of times when people receive feedback and they feel like they get in right and wrong, and then they immediately defend themselves and they don't fully hear what's actually being said to them.
Yeah, for sure. There's this beautiful way of responding when you're receiving feedback too, of acknowledging the underlying emotional intent that you're sensing. Like, I don't necessarily agree every time Jonathan gives me feedback, but if instead of starting with the disagreements, I start by just saying, thank you for your feedback. I can tell that you were sharing this with me from a sincere desire to activate my highest expression. And it's that kind of transition that actually allows for the back and forth to stay fluid instead of constricting into tension. A lot of times when we give feedback, it's really smart to sandwich it with two compliments. And when we go to give...
The sandwich theory, they call
that.
Yeah,
they call it the sandwich theory. When we give feedback, it really helps if we come in from a place of non-attachment and the awareness that the best thing we can do for all of our fellow human beings is to love them. And if we attach to an ideal before we give the feedback, that creates a field effect where there's more tension in the conversation. If before giving the feedback you can create a little bit of distance, a little bit of a detached relationship to the outcome, then we're not creating the expectations and conditions that precharge the field and create the potential for disappointment or reaction.
This is one's also in the same family of giving receive feedback, but confronting people when needed. So this is a situation, maybe you're with a roommate or a lover or a friend where you're seeing them all the time, or a coworker where you absolutely need to get something out. Someone's maybe not following through with the promise and is having a real negative effect. There's skillful and unskillful ways of doing that. And so people who set up that container with care and think about what they want to say and do some scenario plannings about how that person might react and how that other person how you might counter that. It's like you've got a situation where maybe a roommate's not following through with a certain chore, it's not feeling balanced, and you can kind of bring that up, and then like, what are some solutions? What are some possibilities? How are you going to let them give them space to give their perceptions on it and not just assume that your perception is the total truth, and engaging in those dialogues where you can come out with a win-win solution.
And giving them the grace to not have to have a response immediately too. Or if you know that it's going to be charged, maybe consider doing it in a certain medium that allows for that to translate. Like, there are times when things are really heated in the field between two people that it's actually stronger to write a letter or send an email, because it gives people the opportunity to meet that content when they feel resourced and ready to show up to that and receive it. And that putting the power in their hands in the slightest way means that, you have a higher chance of a positive outcome. Also, some of what Jonathan was saying about the pre-planning, there's also a lot to be said for having the conversation before it builds up in your system to have charge. I think there's so often resistance to sharing our truth that creates a moment of explosion in the long run, because we think in some future moment we'll have a more tactful way of conveying ourselves, but all that really happens in the gap, because life is so busy, is a buildup of emotional energy. So Oftentimes, if you're feeling it then and you don't feel ready to talk to the other person about it yet, that's a great case for the letter structure. Just getting it out while your emotions are there.
Handling criticism is another piece of this. At times, we're all going to hear things that maybe we don't want to hear, and getting in a right state of mind to receive that is a very positive thing. Like, this is, first off, you can let yourself know, hey, this is just a perception by someone else. It might or might not hold some truth. You can also bring in the idea that, hey, this might really help me. Sometimes we can't really see ourselves, and it's helpful to hear how we're impacting. Sometimes when we're getting criticisms, it's actually about the other person. It's not about us. Sometimes it's a little bit of both. And when you go into these situations, understanding all these dynamics we're talking about and more, and there's a lot of tools you can do. Just be like, even just breathing slowly while it's coming in, and maybe notice what your immediate reactions are and be like, hey, is that what I want to speak of, or is this a defensive trigger, and giving yourself time before even responding.
Yes, I think most people could stand to take more pauses in communication. So thank you for bringing that up. And this also goes back to the previous episode with the path of purification, because if you have unmet content that you have not purified, the chances of it emerging as a judgment or as a projection in your interpersonal relationships increases. When we cannot handle confronting something or loving something within ourselves, the way that we are still like forced by life to meet that is when we judge it in another person. And so I've seen this plenty of times. The most the thing that you have the most friction about in other people often says something about what is unmet in your own journey. A prime example of this, when someone is really shy, they might have a lot of criticism or judgment around people that express a lot all the time freely, because the opposite end of the polarity creates the contrast, and it generates the externalization of what is unmet within you. So when we are dealing with criticism, if we can use the awareness that there's a possibility of judgment or projection filtering what is being criticized, then we can just get that littlest bit of emotional distance to perceive all of the effects that are going into that moment.
Now we're going to talk about a different aspect of verbal communication, and this is intimacy with an audience. And it's about public speaking. Public speaking is a different dynamic, and there's a lot of other things to consider when you're public speaking. Who's in the audience? What do they know or not know about the topic you're speaking on? It's about projecting your voice. There's also about hand motions. There's also using the things like before about being concise and accurate, and using emotions and a variety of tools to get your points off. It's also important to really know your intention and what aspects of speaking can really do it. For example, do you want to use storytelling? Are you in an influencing mode? Are you introducing something? There's a lot going on with public speaking and a lot of tools, and all of this can be done like in certain kinds of an art form. Also, you want in public speaking and in verbal communication intimacy, there's a huge important talk about managing expectations. I know when I do presenting, often I like to say, hey, this is what we're going to cover today, and this is about the amount of time, and it gets people's tuned in and zoned in about like what the bigger context is. You can do managing expectations in any kind of conversation. You can start things off by like, hey, this is the topic I want to handle right now. I got about this amount of time. This is the goal, and obviously not in informal social stuff, but there's certain aspects when managing expectations is super critical skill to have.
Absolutely. It's cutting off problems at the pass.
And I want to talk about a different model of communication. This is something called the 6 acts of speech, and it's about a different way of thinking about having very clear communication so you can get to agreements with people. So one thing is assessments. Assessments are actually personal opinions, and a lot of times people speak in assessments as if there's truth, and a lot of assessments are quote unquote ungrounded assessments where they're more emotion and there's actually not a lot of data to support it, where people had a certain trigger or they had like one data point and they made a giant story about a situation. And it's be careful that this happens all the time. And so it's also when somebody's saying something and maybe it doesn't, they're not backing it up, it's always good to be like, hey, what are the data points? I understand you've got these conclusions or assessments, but back me in, walk me down your ladder of influence of like how you came to that assessment, which gets to assertions, which is a little bit different. Assertions are actually verifiable facts. So you're kind of saying, like you did this, and then this is the story I have about it. So then you're getting to the verifiable fact. Like I saw you scratch your nose, and then maybe I made an assertion, an assessment based on it, or somebody was late and someone's accusing someone of late, and they can say, hey, look, we said you'd be in at this time at 9, and now I got 10 days in a row you got here at 9:15 or later. That's a verifiable fact. Maybe there's something about that. So there's a difference between assessments and assertions is about the ability to have verifiable facts. Then there's declarations are basically a statement that has accountability to it. So, for example, I will come over to your house, Soraya's, at 10 o'clock. So it has a specific time, and I will bring fudge brownies. I mean, we live together, but that's just an example of what it looks like.
I want brownies.
Nice. Yeah. Requests are made when somebody can say, I would like this thing. Hey, or Soraya might come back like, hey, can you bring brownies and ice cream? And so it's like a kind of a counter. And then promises are when you're getting to make like a specific agreement, like, hey, I promise to come over by 10:30 and I'm bringing ice cream, brownies, and sprinkles on top, and I promise that I'll actually will do that. So you're kind of getting very specific. And then lastly, there's offers, which is just something you're making without, like, you could say the same thing, like, I offer to do that rather than promise. Like, would you like it if I bring these brownies and sprinkles over? That's like an offer rather than a promise. I'm not promising to do it. I'm just saying, hey, this is a possibility. And so these kinds of distinctions can help us communicate more clearly.
Yeah, so I'm actually not as familiar with these, so I just wanted to ask a few questions. I really love it. So what I'm experiencing is some of these have more commitment than others, and some of these are more grounded than others. And so is this used as a tool to create clearer communication?
Yeah, it's about having like 2 or more people get together and having clear communications about the facts of what they're talking about, as well as what agreements they're trying to make. So it's about really agreements and the facts around them. So we're getting our facts correct, and we're getting very tight on what kind of commitments we're making to each other.
Awesome. And then the next tool that we were going to speak to is attachment styles. And I know that there are a lot of people that cover this, and you can have an entire couples work session purely on attachment styles. So we're going to go over this at a high level, but there are 4 kinds in the most mainstream simplified version, which is anxious attachment, avoidant attachment, anxious avoidant attachment, which is the hybrid, and secure attachment. And so if you are anxiously attached, you have almost this clinginess about your relationship, and what soothes and reassures you is being closer. And if you overdo this can be smothering to your partner. Whereas the avoidant attachment has the opposite problem. They're in moments where intimacy is being generated, feeling a reflex away or back or into their own space. And so the most traditional conflict within this whole family of styles is an anxious person and an avoidant person that create this push pull tug of war where they're both trying to get their needs met from the with or from the other person.
I just want to say a little bit about anxious attachment because that's the one that I lean towards. It's also the word anxious is there's just a lot of worry and anxiety that the relationship's gonna fall apart. There's cheating, there's betrayal, there's worry they won't fall through. So it's just a lot of an anxiety and worry. This all stems back to your relationship to your parents and what happened there, and so. And so, just anyways, it's important to understand that there's a lot of anxious thoughts behind the reason for the quote unquote could turn up as the smothering or some of the other things that Soraya said.
Yeah, for sure. And the anxious avoidant attachment style is a hybrid where, because you have blocks to true intimacy and connection, you'll play whatever role is not in the field. So if your partner heals their anxious attachment, then you'll switch from being avoidant to being anxious because your nature is to sabotage intimacy. And this, goes back to early childhood and how our parents raised us and whether they created a secure attachment foundation. A lot of people will attribute this to, how long they breastfeed or how often you hold your baby. And there's a lot of ideas as to what generates this, but in general, if you had a parent that was hard to get attention from, you can have the response of, like wanting to suck up to that parent's attention and retrieve the attention. And so that can create more of an anxious style. Whereas if you totally give up because their affection isn't winnable, then that could become more of an avoidant attachment style.
There's a lot of nuance to this because you could have a family dynamic where certain aspects are being met and some others. Some families are very intellectual and not very affectionate. There are other ones that are holding but they don't listen well, or there's maybe a parent that dominates and that has a certain effect on it, or parents who aren't good with conflict and parents that worry. These are human beings, so it's most people have, and also disappointed. These aren't like black and white things. You can have percentages. Two anxious attachment people might not look alike. They might have subtle differences or degrees, and so there's a lot of nuance within these, and it's really important to get in tune with your own style. And it's really positive because once you start to understand what your style is and your habits, then you start to see when they come up, they don't have so much weight around you that you can have some distance to it. It's like, oh, I'm doing that anxious attachment thing, and now you can label it and see it. You're not beholden to it.
Yeah, there's a couple other relationship phenomenon that we didn't put in our original outline that are popping up for me right now. This push-pull dynamic also reminds me of what's called the human magnet syndrome, which is the tendency of a codependent to end up with a narcissist. Similarly, the distortion along the spectrum is often generated through childhood conditioning. And I do think in modern times of the internet, we are a little quick to use these terms, but if we can hold them less as, almost disorders and more as phenomenon within relationship, I think there's a lot to learn from the human magnet syndrome as well. Its creator also coined the term self-love deficit disorder, which is basically anything less than secure attachment being generated by increased need for self-love capacities in a human. And I think a lot of the times when we experience these intimacy distortions, it is coming back to a self-love thing. But as far as the path of intimacy and human connection, there is a balance between what we hold as accountability within our relationship and what we hold for ourselves. Another thing that's coming up for me is the dramatic triangle of the victim, hero, persecutor, and how that plays out in intimate relationships. It's often, if someone is on the triangle and they're feeling the victim, they will incite their partner to play one of the two other roles. And if they, if the victim steps into like anger because their body is giving them a burst of emotion to try to empower themselves, then in that moment of empowerment, they might switch into becoming the persecutor or the hero and turn the other person into the victim role to try to balance things out.
Yeah, the hero, this model, the hero, the victim, the savior, the
dramatic triangle.
The dramatic triangle is valid only from like if you from a kind of first tier perspective where you actually are only seeing like kind of locally, but from a more meta perspective, all these roles are just everything's just happening because of people's backgrounds and energetics, and there really isn't any victims. it's like just energy moving, and people need to have certain experiences. That's a high level understanding, so I understand if you hear that and you don't relate to it. But this is a place we want to get to where we want to get more meta, and we can see more above about these different distinctions and how they're playing out in our lives, and how we can, once we can see them, it's like greater self-awareness, and all consciousness is greater and greater awareness of what's possible. And then this is where the liberation and freedom comes from, this and many other problems. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I would loosely ideate that personal responsibility and sovereignty will pull you off of the dramatic triangle in any position. Because a lot of times the reason we're in this triangle is because there's some part of us that is bouncing off of other people's fields instead of being willing to meet something within ourselves or hold a certain kind of power. So a lot of the times when people are stuck on this triangle, it's important to look at what can we pull back into our own authorship. Like, where can we reclaim responsibility instead of feeding and diffusing the lack thereof into the field and creating reactive effects.
I just want to make a real concrete example about like the victim, for example. If somebody felt like they were victimized as a childhood and they were unable to digest it, they might, their psychology will keep seeking out other victim scenarios and keep giving them an opportunity to digest what they were unable to digest as a kid. Because that's how purification works, is because your body and consciousness wants to heal. It's always trying to heal. It's always trying to set up different contexts so you can feel the things that you were unable to heal. And then once you're able to purify all your stuff, you have a much different view on reality. So that's kind of why I just want to give a real example about what I'm talking about.
Yeah, and I want to speak just briefly upon the role of hero and how in a lot of ways it overlaps with the role of the codependent, because I think there's this tricky thing that comes up, especially before we're fully independent in life, where we have some people feel this desire to live life through other people rather than risk being our own main character, and that instinct to be the hero or the intelligent best friend instead of appearing as the main character in our own life can feel really noble and seductive, but it actually perpetuates victimhood and persecution because of the contrast that it generates. So it's important when we feel the desire to rescue someone that we really check ourselves and pull back from that. And this goes back to bonding styles. There's two kinds of bonding: trauma bonding and authentic bonding. And with trauma bonding, where it's that rescuer energy of We're bonding because you share your pain with me, and that creates a chemical reaction effect that generates these very intense bonds. Like you'll see this in siblings that grew up with really challenging family environments. Is they're super close, and it is great that we have this human instinct to bond together when we're experiencing suffering, but it does tend to create more of a social dependency on perpetuating the suffering to feel the unity. And so, what we want to promote is authentic bonding. So, instead of calling up your friend and complaining about all of your trials and tribulations, calling up your friend and talking about what you've created, or what excited you about your day, or things that actually promote positive energy in the field and come from this very genuine place. And speaking of that authentic bonding, I kind of want to skip ahead a little bit to authentic relating, because I think they're very related. Authentic relating is actually something that's almost like teaching authentic bonding back to culture. There are series upon series of games and conversational leads that fall under authentic relating and are used in social contexts almost like icebreakers to get people to connect from a more heart opened place, a more genuine place. Making eye contact is often a part of the exercise, and it promotes a field where people can't hide from each other, where the chances of you getting away with being a wallflower disappear. And when people are called to the forefront of their experience from the beginning through pairing off in dyads or some other mechanism, then we actually create the field where authentic bonding is prioritized over trauma bonding. So it's really beautiful. And we actually have a friend who produced a whole book of authentic relating games and skills.
Oh, Jason Diggs' his name. It's there's a big here in Boulder area. There's a big thing called circling. I think it also has a big center in California. Also is where it started. And Jason has a book. I think it's called Energy Equals Conflict. He just made an Audible out of it, and he's really really good as word. And this book has different games in it, and we highly recommend it. I just want to one thing about authentic relating that is important is something called circling. And circling is this dynamic where usually it has a facilitator, and there's one person who's circled by a bunch of other people, and they just give them feedback or facilitate conversations about how they're coming across. I've done it a few times, and I've always walked away with a greater self-awareness of things I wasn't necessarily seeing. So there's authentic relating is a deep pattern of tools that's good for people to be aware of. It really helps people deepen their intimacy with each other and with themselves.
Going back into the realm of intimate relationships for a little bit, there are a couple tools that I personally believe are so key for understanding your partner's relationship style and intimacy style. And the first one is a little more common. It's called the 5 love languages, which includes physical touch, verbal affirmation, quality time, gift giving, and acts of service. And I'll go into more depth about what each of these entails, but for the most part, I feel their titles are a little self-explanatory, and I want to get into why this helps people so much. Because there's so many times where one partner thinks they're demonstrating massive amounts of love, and the other partner's not receiving that at all, and they feel neglected, in fact, because they're not speaking the same love language. And so when we become aware of all 5 of these and we develop a lucidity in speaking and receiving all of them, we create not only more diversity in our romantic relationships, but also more ability to acknowledge when people are demonstrating genuine caring. And so physical touch is not just sexuality. Physical touch is also high fives, leaning against each other, uh, butt smacks, all these little gestures of connection that involve some sort of skin to skin engagement. And I think that when people have this as a deep language and they're with a partner that is learning, I think the most important thing to convey is that it can really be simple. It's more the consistency of being engaged on the physical plane that really matters to people than like the depth. Like there's even times when someone has handed me an object and the way that they handed it to me involved a kind of contact that felt like intimacy and not just shoving it off to another person. So that's physical touch. Verbal affirmation is essentially compliments and appreciation and gratitude, and making sure that we actually communicate in words what it is that we find inspiring or special or supportive in our partner. And then quality time has the most variations. Quality time can include even texting and phone calls if the person actually feels like the experience is creating genuine, loving connection. But for some people, quality time is only one on one, in person, making lots of eye contact. So, with quality time in particular, it's really important to understand the custom nature of what is really ticking that box for your partner. Gift giving is the next love language, and it really stems from the idea. I mean, gift giving is one of my primary love languages. The idea that when you give something to someone, it is embedded with the thoughtfulness of what that object represents almost. It's like you, even when I wasn't around, still held me in your heart, still valued me. Feeling valued as a way of feeling loved is often an expression of people that have a gift giving love language. And it really works in the symbolic realm too, especially when you buy things that don't degrade. I know roses is such a stereotype of the gift giving, but when you buy something that is, say, like a crystal, that isn't something that's going to decay and be thrown away. And so you can actually embed meaning in that. When Jonathan gave me a bracelet recently, he told me a thing he appreciated in every bead of that bracelet, and he fused verbal affirmation and gift giving for very powerful effect. So there's a lot of ways to enhance your gift giving capacities, and if you don't feel super strong in gift giving, I like to tell people you can take a lot of pressure off of this by even just, I walked home today and I saw this flower and it made me happy, and then it made me think of how you make me happy, and so I wanted you to have it. It doesn't have to be like I searched 5 thrift stores for this piece of cabinetry you really wanted. It can be as simple as that, just like I was talking about physical touch being as simple as holding hands when you walk. And then the last one is acts of service, which is plain and simple reality of this is some people feel really loved and supported when you do the laundry for them, and some people are not feeling love. They're just like, oh, they did it and good, it's done. When someone takes time out of their experience to do some sort of act of service for me, it removes burden. And so like acts of service is a really big love language for personality types that are really busy or really stressed. because they're receiving that love in actual ability to like loosen their grip a little bit on life and life's reins, and it makes them feel really together with another person when they feel this almost like sharing of responsibility together. So acts of service is a really big one for a lot of people. They may not be consciously aware that this is a love language of theirs, but when they actually look at their relationships, they're like, oh, actually I am getting a kickback from that when I feel served. Like when someone cooks me a fancy dinner, that does something for me. And so yes, we use all of these love languages to be master lovers and communicators. And the next system that I wanted to talk about is called the Erotic Blueprint. And I actually only discovered this fairly recently. The Erotic Blueprint is a very catchy title, but I think this says more about how humans relate in intimacy than the title implies. So there are 5 kinds of humans in the Erotic Blueprint. There are people that are kinky, sensual, sexual, energetic, and that are shapeshifters, which is to say all of them. And we have a lot of ideas of what it means to be kinky from the BDSM community, but to kind of paint a broader lens of this feeling in our intimacy is that when we create power dynamics or polarity, or like there's some sort of dramatic like impact, play or sensory deprivation, that we're creating the tension that actually drives our chemistry. And so that's one of the types. And then the sensual type is someone who's very activated by sensory reality, and the website almost describes it like they're being turned on by their environment, like the right mood lighting, the right music, the right smells in the room. All of these things are activating their body's sensory faculties and pulling them deeper into an availability to intimacy. So there are lots of sensualists out there that really exemplify this deep wheelhouse. And then there's sexual, which is the more traditional form of intimacy as far as mainstream culture depicts it, where people are more immediately going to sexual organs to generate tension and pleasure and excitement. And when you have a partner that's like primary focus is your mouth, your chest, and your V, then that is definitely someone whose primary is sexual. And so one of the things that I like to keep track of in experimenting with this in the relationship is I think culture kind of conditions us to be the sexual type. And a lot of times when this spectrum comes into their relationship, they realize that actually they are more turned on by one of the other categories. So I definitely encourage exploration. The last one is the energetic type. And energetic people are actually charged by the energy. Like, these are the people that can almost like zap each other from across the room and feel the tension, or like they can just be in each other's personal space and stare into each other's eyes, and they already feel that like aliveness tingling online. They're incredibly sensitive. They can easily be overstimulated by partners that are like purely sexually blueprinted, because there's almost this electrical charge to the sensitivity of their body, and it takes very light touches to activate this field, and sometimes no touch at all. And so it's more about almost like the theater, I would dare say, of of the connection that really draws them in. And then the shapeshifter is simply someone that either can play in all the types or enjoys all the types. I think there are people that go through phases that identify as a shapeshifter, and really they're just finding their groove. But I think there are genuine shapeshifters as well. And my only comment about a shapeshifter as a shapeshifter is to find someone that has as much diversity as you hold, because it's easy to get with a partner that has a singular style and feel understimulated. So shapeshifters often work really well with other shapeshifters, but
or a shapeshifter can help expand their partner.
Can help, exactly. That's where I was getting to. Yep.
Yeah, you're not stuck with one, right? You can evolve.
Precisely. Shapeshifters can be really fun partners for exploration.
Emotional. We're going to go into a new area as we're closing out here. Emotional intelligence is a big one, and there are a lot of different dimensions to emotional intelligence. One is self-management or self-regulation, and this is the ability to manage ourselves, to make sure that we're on time, to make sure that we keep our emotions in check, and it includes a lot of the other emotional intelligences like self-awareness. So in order to have really good self-regulation, self-management, you've got to be aware of what's going on and what is the context. What do I need to do to manage myself in this situation? What is my emotions right now versus how that emotions actually affect the current situation? So there's a lot of mindfulness qualities to it.
This really feeds in very closely with something called the window of tolerance that is taught a lot in therapy. When I was in therapy, they gave us a 1 to 10 scale of our emotions, and there's hypoarousal and hyperarousal. But essentially, when we're developing our emotional intelligence, we want to get to the level of sophistication where we can feel when our everyday 4 to 6 range is starting to shoot up to a 7 or 8, because by the time it gets to 9 or 10, we're not actually easily regulatable. Like we're usually in a deep trigger and we're just expressing our emotions. So it's in awareness of when our emotions are J-curving that we can hit it or acknowledge it at the 7 or 8 scale as building outside of our window of tolerance, and make an adjustment to restabilize, which is where the self-regulation tools come in. An example of a self-regulation tool is called changing channels, where you blink and pretend that every time you blink, you're changing the channel on a television, and you just pull in a completely spontaneous new thought to kind of reset your emotional pattern. Do you have any other examples of self-regulation tools, Jonathan?
I mean, like if you're, for example, really angry, you got a lot of emotion up, you could yell. I used to have a yelling practice, or you could put your mouths if it's not an appropriate place like you're out, you could put your hands over your mouth and yell, and
while shaking your torso back and forth,
shaking your torso out, or like punching your hand into your fist, or taking a pillow and smashing your hands into a pillow. And so just a good way to, if you notice that you're running emotionally really high, how to release it so you can ground and do to the next thing, which is social skills. Social skills are a huge part of emotional intelligence. And a lot of the things we talked about earlier involve that, like active listening or reflective listening. It also involves just like speaking succinctly, which we talked about earlier, and also being confident in your social skills, but also just understanding how in your culture social skills work. How do people approach people? Like it's different at a party or with your family, and being able to read a room and figure out how to interject, or when you're talking too much, or listening and how to balance that, or notice what's going on in a group, and how to energy dips and spikes, and how to deal with all that kind of stuff.
An example of this is if you go into a room and you feel this energy of people are coming more from the mind, I might give more conversational up ramp when I want to speak to one of my emotions, because I want to give people more of an opportunity to gauge and engage with a relationship with a different plane than what is currently radiating as the comfort zone of the social dynamic. And so there's a way where we can, in this case, for example, create transitions or kind of teaser the direction we want to evolve the social equation. And those kinds of social skills are really appreciated because it creates a stronger consent field and a safer container for people to explore with parts of their expression that are a little more outskirts to them.
The next one I want to talk about is personal resilience. And there's been a lot of studies that showed the people who are most successful have grit, and that's another form of the personal resilience. People who can experience failure or being wrong or feeling frustrated or having situation not go as they planned and being able to push through, instead looking at this as an opportunity to learn something or to practice their obstacle removing skills and keep their energy and focus high and not getting deterred by the situation. That's a really important characteristic. Next one we're talking about is self-direction. This is just like where you're really in tune with your heart and what you're trying to get out of, could be out of life or a certain situation. If you're going to be a leader, you're really going to have to have really strong on the self-direction category. Self-awareness is an enormous topic, which could cover all kinds of things like self-aware of what's going on in your own mind, what's going on in your behavior, being self-aware of what's going on with others. It could involve different typology systems like the gene keys or human design or MBTI, Enneagram. There's a lot going on with self-awareness.
Yeah, and to get more details as to what self-awareness looks like, if you're watching this out of order, you can review our episodes on Path of Purification or Path of Capacity. Those are both self-awareness oriented.
Then there's empathy, which is like the ability to feel and understand what's going on with others at a kind of a deeper level. And then we got, speaking with that, is we want to talk about working with emotions. And emotions has a lot of subcategories, and when you actually understand what those are, and then your life with emotion gets a lot easier. So first off, just even perceiving when emotions arise in yourself and others. A lot of people are so in their head or have ADD, they don't actually perceive when emotions are arising in the field. Go ahead.
And I wanted to just tie empathy back in here with that, because I think people aren't commonly educated on the difference between empathy and sympathy. And sympathy is almost like an intellectual understanding of that other person's experience and saying like, oh, I feel sorry for them. But empathy is actually feeling some of what the other person's feeling. And so as we develop more sophistication with perceiving emotions within ourselves, we actually do turn on more availability for empathy.
Then there's like using emotions, or using your intelligence, where you've got the full range of all the different emotions, and you know when to be caring or tear up, when to use authoritative emotions, when to use silliness, and so you really become much more of a dynamic communicator when you're able to have all the emotions at your in your bag of tools and being able to express them clearly. Understanding emotions is just like being so familiar with each emotion and what they mean and how to deal with them and represent them. And managing emotions is really what we were talking about before with self-management and self-regulation. Last two pills is we just wanted to get into mindfulness. But mindfulness has a lot of subdynamics, which is how we impact others, how others impact you. Yeah, reading nonverbal communication, about in both also like being mindful what's going on with you and other people. And lastly, I wanted to do before we wrap up is just briefly mention observation skills, being able to observe without judgment, be able to observe without impact of past reference points. What I mean by that is a lot of times the way our personal psychology works is that we often see the world through our traumas that happened to our past, and it's a real high level skill to be able to recognize that's happening and see that reference point is empty, and then allow to just be there with the purity of the moment now without any past reference points. And that's a place we all want to get to. It's a high level skill, and then it's a quite a process to go through all that. But that's how you end up getting one with your soul.
Yeah, and there's positive perception witnessing in here too, with observing the best light within a person when you engage with them, because when you do that, you summon that part of their energy into the co-creative field between the two of you.
Yeah, it's easy to see someone with the things you don't like about them, the criticism, because which is usually something you also don't like about yourself because it's a projection. You can get to the place where you're seeing everyone in their best light and their best potential. That's like seeing them like soul to soul.
And if any of this mindfulness and observation skills stuff really spoke to you, we would love to go deeper with you, perhaps in a one-on-one session on those or any of the tools that we've discussed. We do individual and couples work, and these are some of our favorite skills because we're covering them at a high level right now, but when we actually apply them to people's lives and scenarios, there can be a lot of clarity really quickly. So if you're enjoying all this content, but you're getting a haha, easier said than done kind of feeling, set up a call with us. Maybe we can serve your evolution.
I can be reached at Jonathan@relationshipalchemist.com.
And I can be released at Soraya@relationshipalchemist.com.
And our website is www.relationshipalchemist.com. And we got a YouTube channel that also has all our previous episodes. Next week, we'll be finishing off the second person and talk about the path of collaboration or community dynamics. It's like, how do we make organizations, groups, community structures work efficiently and effectively. I hope you enjoyed today's show. We look forward to being with you next time.
Until then.
Have a good night, folks.
As we all take accountability for our energy coherence, we create the world where more is possible. More beauty, more magic, more joy. So let's all step into conscious creatorship together. Sending you omnipresent love.